Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to one more week of the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, and this week joining us from a city whose name I can't pronounce near Guildford is Ben Maynard. Hi Ben, welcome to the show.
Hello there. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. English is a difficult language for us, the non-native speakers, as there's so many different sounds. But the town you live in, that was a mind-boggling name. What was the name?
Godalming.
Oh my God.
But I mean, I don't think it matters kind of what your native tongue is. I think people generally pronounce it differently, whether it's Godalming is a common mispronunciation, but I believe it's pronounced Godalming.
All right. Very good. Very good. So Ben is an experienced coach, a trainer, and a mentor assisting senior leaders in medium to large organizations with organizational design and the, of course, natural cultural repercussions. So Ben, that was a short intro. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and how did you end up becoming a Scrum Master?
Sure thing. So I've been working in kind of software like professionally for well over a decade now. I think the actual number of years escapes me. I started my career in technology from being a business analyst a long time ago at JP Morgan. I didn't kind of serve well being a business analyst, even though it's something which at university I'd kind of pretty much studied for. So I had all the tools, all the techniques, but what I found was that I was far too much of an anxious person to be writing long-winded requirements documents.
And very detailed too.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, I remember my time at JP Morgan, we had to kind of present our fully elaborated, elicited requirements in document format to the rest of the business analyst community and have them kind of tear it apart. And it was at that point when I was just kind of thinking, well, it's never going to be perfect. And learning the magical phrase included but not limiting to, and putting that at the end of each or the beginning of each requirement was a way to cover myself.
It's like legal language, right? You want to cover all the angles possible.
Exactly, and you want to make sure that your backside is covered, and it's all angles of your own backside. And there was never any kind of view of the whole. So when my first requirement document went off, there's some fantastic people to effectively write the software, and the software came back and it bore no resemblance to this picture I had in my mind, and I just felt this doesn't work. And I'd learned about agile practices. I mean, I did my dissertation in test-driven development, and this was probably in the early 2000s, I think, and back then it was a relatively new thing. So whilst I'd been introduced to it at university and written my dissertation on TDD, I hadn't had the opportunity to experience any of it professionally. So when I kind of left JP Morgan, went to RBS, and it was still working as a business analyst, but gradually became more involved in the act of actually kind of creating the software as well, which I really enjoyed. And I found that I was much more comfortable, yes, doing some analysis, but also working on the database design, working on the database implementation, testing some of the software, pairing up with some of the developers. I found that much more relaxing and enjoyable, and I found that what we produced as a result was notionally better than what I was doing before. And long story short, we built this ridiculous monolithic system, and the powers that be decided that actually that system should be decommissioned and we should go for a vendor platform. Around the same time, I'd been on a Scrum Master course. It kind of lit a little fire inside me and reminded me of all the great stuff that I'd learned back at university. And so when somebody phoned me and said, "Look, do you want to run this delivery?" I jumped at the opportunity to decommission the system I'd just built. And when they said, "Well, how would you like to?"
Yeah, after all, you knew the system quite well, right?
Well, I did. I knew the users. I knew what they wanted. This was back in around the time of Dodd-Frank reforms in the financial industry. So when it came to the clearing of OTC derivatives, maybe somewhat too technical for some people, but I knew my way around it, and I knew my way around the regulation. So having been given this opportunity was it was great, if not a bit weird. And when they said to me, how would you like to run the delivery? I said, well, I'd like to use Scrum. And for me, that's where it all started. And that's where I became a Scrum Master, and then over time, what I'd call a fake product owner. And my journey really kind of accelerated from that point. So I ended up with my first Scrum Master gig purely by being given the opportunity to decommission a platform that I just built.
Indeed, that's quite an interesting story. I do want to hear more about that fake product, or maybe we will hear about it in the next story, since today's Monday, and of course we want to dive into the fail story, a story where we learn a lot but also go through a rough spot. So tell us that story, Ben.
Well, failure has been a good bedfellow of mine for a large part of my career. And I've learned a lot as a result. If I think back to probably my first biggest failure when acting I suppose it was I was kind of trying to do a dual kind of Scrum Master and kind of fake product owner type role, but I was there as the team saw me as their Scrum Master, and coming from an analysis background, I thought that I could be really, really useful, and I thought that I could sit down on my own and effectively create the backlog for the team, not asking the team anything about what they'd like to see, not really knowing much about the vendor platform that we were going to use, but having a reasonably deep understanding of the business context and the users. So I sat down and I spent a week crafting this ridiculously sized product backlog, using my newfound skills and user stories and writing everything in a kind of as a I want, say that structure, which I did with varying degrees of success. But then when it came to actually handing it to the team and showing it to the team, they just laughed at me. I just explained how it was of absolutely no use to them, but they didn't understand where I was coming from.
Well, why was that, though? Why did they say that it was no use to them? And I mean, after all, I'm sure that many of our listeners have gone through a similar situation where they spend a lot of time, really carefully crafting user stories, and then they show them to the rest of the team. The team goes like, I can't do anything with this. So what was the reason, Ben?
A lack of conversation. And as a result of that, a lack of learning collectively between us. Yes, I had lots of expertise, but I also didn't give them the opportunity to learn anything. I didn't give them the opportunity to actually come up with a solution for the perceived business problems. I didn't know how feasible anything was that I had written down. So when they took a look at it, it wasn't feasible. We didn't really know a lot of the language that I had used, so I was going to have to talk to them about it anyway. And it wasn't something that they could work with. It also, they've been sold a dream of working in a kind of Scrum agile environment where they'll be involved in the conversation. And all they'd seen so far was some guy they barely knew handing over a massive requirements document to them in the form of a product backlog.
Yeah, to be honest, or to be fair, rather, that was something you were very familiar with, right? Writing documents in isolation.
Absolutely. It's what my career had been to an extent. And it was something which I'd been recognized and rewarded for. And I think at that point, it was the anxiety that I mentioned previously. That was definitely a huge part of it. I was driven by that. So as a result, I did what I was most comfortable with. I did the most obvious thing for me, which was to do this upfront work.
So how do we recover from a situation like that? Now, maybe you're going to tell us what you did at that point, or maybe you're going to reflect on what happened and then kind of wish you would have done something, like time machine style. If I was there again, I would. But tell us, for the Scrum Masters out there who might be in a similar situation, let's say the product owner just did that, and there's plenty of product owners who do exactly what you described. How do we recover from that situation?
Well, my path to recovery was throwing it all away. There was no point in trying. Well, no, actually saying that we tried to re-engineer. We tried to kind of scrape things and augment things, but it was pointless. It was pointless. The product backlog isn't something which should be the manifestation of a single person's mind. It's something that should be built collaboratively, and it's something the team should take ownership from. And so rather than trying to tweak it, trying to change it, we just threw it all away and started from scratch. We had no other choice. And I think that often, Since then, I've been faced with many situations where we have multiple product backlogs, and we are looking at them saying, well, how do we merge these together? What do we do? And by and large, I find most of the time the best thing to do is just to start again. Write it off as a piece of learning, but don't try and kind of manipulate what you've got, because you're always going to be having hangovers from that. It's a learning opportunity.
And of course, when we start again, we need to take a different approach. So what was the approach you took then when you started again?
We really tried to understand, one, the user problems, the problem we're trying to solve. We also became quite involved in looking at different ways in which to break down these large features. I think for us, that was the thing that really made a difference. And the one thing we found very exciting as a group was to just look at a big chunky feature that we had and try and find interesting ways to break it down to small pieces where we could effectively go up to the head of business every single sprint and say that this is what we have created. Because the mindset we were able to quickly bring into that team at that time was the idea that, if we what are we here to do? What are we being paid for? We knew how much each sprint cost. And so we wanted to be able to go up each sprint and kind of show the business exactly what they'd spent their money on in the last 2 weeks. And so then that really drove us to say, well, what are really clever ways of us breaking down these backlog items, these big chunky features. And what that spawned from that point onwards was a really deep and thorough investigation into technically how do we up our level of expertise and put ourselves in a situation where we can do that, because this wasn't software which we knew inside and out. It wasn't software which we had access to the source code from. This was a vendor package that we had very limited ability to really do a huge amount with. So it was that looking at the features, finding interesting ways to break them down using things like story mapping, looking at vertical slicing, which then led us onto this very fantastic path, which we kind of spent the next 18 months really focusing on, of being technically excellent.
Absolutely. And of course, getting back to one of the core aspects of Agile, which is the incremental deliveries, right? To prove that you know what you're doing and that you are delivering value while you are learning, right?
Precisely. And I think this is something which is often overlooked. There is a difference between being iterative and being incremental. And looking at your backlog as a series of features, paying attention to the invest principles means that you are able to do things incrementally. But I think the one thing which is often not spoken about enough in the Agile world is the importance of technical excellence, and that your ability to actually deliver something of value, or something which is perhaps not something that the users can use, but really shows that you have tested some hypotheses and that you are getting closer to releasing the ultimate value, really is hindered by your ability to use techniques such as stubbing or mocking, and look at techniques such as walking skeletons and tracer bullets to actually technically put yourself in the position where you can do that.
Absolutely. And the technical enablers, and in this case skills and knowledge and experience, are extremely important to be able to be coherent, right, with the Agile adoption and the Agile perspective. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't really only about backlogs. We were talking about backlogs when you started the story, but what we end up with is that actually doing the work in an Agile manner requires a different perspective. And if you write stuff up front, you're probably preventing the Agile approach to delivering that stuff you just wrote down into that long document.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a difficult balance to be struck, and it's between the level to which you can successfully vertically slice your backlog items and your technical capability. But that is a balance that you'll be completely unable to strike if you don't have the conversation when you're creating those backlog items.
Absolutely. Thank you for telling that story, Ben. Very insightful.
Thank you.
Monday is about what we learn from our obstacles and our failures. But tomorrow is Team Tuesday here on the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast. We explore teams and their journeys, the habits they develop that threaten their performance, how each of our guests help their teams evolve, and the one key lesson they learned from that experience. We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.